Well, welcome everybody to Brainstorming the Human Connection, brought to you by the South Dakota Humanities Council. My name is Lawrence Diggs. I will be your host and inquisitor today. So we're hoping that all of you, in addition to watching and listening, will actually join in this very important conversation. In recent years, more than ever before, we have become aware of many of the kinds of atrocities that were put onto the native populations who were here. And the story is one that's harrowing, really. And it's only now becoming apparent how deep and how devastating that experience was to people. And I have a personal, let's say, experience with that, because I was asked to come out to Mobridge to do a presentation at their local library. And I checked into a motel the night before so that I would be there and not have to wake up really early in the morning to go there. And I had a fitful sleep, and I went to sleep, and then I had a dream. And in that dream, there were children saying, why isn't our story told? And I should say, my presentation had nothing to do with children. You know, it had nothing to do with even Native people. But for some reason, I had this dream, and all of these children, it was almost like a nightmare, really, but all these children are saying, why isn't our story being told? And basically, I woke up in the next morning with this kind of drive to say something, right? I mean, I can't say everything, but I can use whatever voice I have. And one of the first results of that was this poem, and it's called Cries of the Children. The cries of the children arise. Years of tears have finally loosened the grave pit and dried spit from their lips, and now their loosened lips cry, why? Why did the Jesus who loves all the children of the world hate us? Why did Jesus send his anointed to rip us from the arms of our mothers and all we loved and loved us? Why did Jesus allow them to sodomize us to death and dump our frail bodies into unmarked holes in the ground? Why did the all-powerful Jesus, who knows all and sees all, not care enough to save us from his people? Why would we want to go to heaven, where we would meet and live forever with those who tortured and murdered us, and a Jesus who would enable them to make such a hell for us here on earth? Why? That poem came from a place that I don't know where it came from. It came from someplace outside of me, because I didn't go there with that even on my mind, really. But today, we're going to be talking not only about those kinds of atrocities committed often by our most trusted institutions. We're going to be talking about not only those atrocities, but also the more subtle but yet insidious, or kind of penetrating things that go on to create the situations that Native Americans find themselves in today, marginalized from our general society. We're going to have a conversation with Tamara St. and as you know, she's yet a legislator in the state. But we want to have a conversation about all of those kinds of things that were, maybe we can say they quote happened in the past. I'm one who thinks they're still happening, but what we, not only that, but maybe what we can be doing about it. So welcome, Tamara.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
Let's start off by talking about the Orange Shirt Day project. Can you tell us about that and what's it about?
Sure. Coincidentally, yesterday in Sisseton-Wahpeton Tribal Council, I'm told that they passed a resolution to recognize Orange Shirt Day. I was approached by a councilwoman who wanted to be sure that we were participating and encouraging the community and even broader our schools and others to acknowledge Orange Shirt Day. And if you were to go on the internet and look at the background in this story, it originated in Canada, and I believe it is a national holiday now, but it started with a woman by the name of Phyllis Webstad, who was a First Nations child, and she entered into residential school. She was excited to attend school, and her mother took her to pick out a shirt for her first day of school, and she wore an orange shirt. She was really excited, and when she got there, the school, in their policies or their methods of assimilation and supposed education, removed her shirt. They took her shirt and of course required her to wear like a uniform. She was basically forced to wear whatever the school wore. And everything that I think happened subsequent to that, things like the cutting of their hair or the outline of basically their cultural identity, their language, their means of prayer, all of those things were very traumatic to her. And, she doesn't, to my knowledge, speak about so much any sort of physical abuse, but certainly the experience was something that was very traumatic. And so she found as an adult, she didn't wear the color orange because it sort of triggered that experience. And so in an effort to really understand that, what is a common experience for so many Indigenous people across Canada and the United States, wanting to share that, she proclaimed Orange Shirt Day and brought it to others, and it just became a movement that grew. So the orange shirts really symbolize that common experience of what some people would even call a cultural genocide, those assimilation practices. And they may have changed over the years, but, we still saw those things in the 50s and 60s, things that began in the late 1800s and, were a part of so many lives and at various levels, I think, of impact and trauma. But certainly there are very few in our Indigenous families, very few that have maybe escaped the traumatic impact and then historical genocide, the historical trauma that went along with it, that passed down through different generations.
I think we underplay the harm that cultural genocide has on a people because we concentrate on the physical form at the expense of what else makes us human. Can you talk a little bit more about the damage that cultural genocide does?
Sure. One of the things that in studying this, and I guess to sort of lay some groundwork here, as a historian and a researcher for the tribe, it's always my goal to relay history in a factual manner and just to sort of explain the way that I share things. So in the 1889, the Indian commissioner at that time had released a letter, like a sort of a guidance of what was going to happen, sort of a 1 through 10 of their policies for assimilation of our children. And within it, you find what ultimately is the cutting off of your kinship ties and the removal of things like your spiritual practices, how you pray, how you speak, how you dress, all of those things of cultural identity. So to see all of these things happen, it basically at the end, it said the autonomy of the individual would be enforced above all. And so essentially you're stripped bare of everything that probably speaks to your identity as a Native person. And so, the impacts of that, I think, even in my own life as a daughter of somebody that went through that boarding school process, and as a historian, I've done many interviews with people that have that experience. The number one thing I think that they all say or talk about is the loneliness of being taken away from your home, taken away from your family. The level of loneliness that one experiences is really, I think, we talk a lot about mental health now. If you can imagine the mental health or the state of all of these children that were sent so far away or were left in these boarding schools. And like one woman said, how do you learn how to parent if you didn't have a parent? How do you show love if no love was shown to you? These things were very institutional. You had matrons that maybe oversaw, the day to day, but like she said, there was never anybody there to hug you or tell you that you were okay. In the end, one woman had told me that I knew that I didn't belong with white people. I didn't belong with Native people. I knew that I really didn't belong anywhere. She said it affected my every relationship. It affected my marriage and how I parented. And, so I think understanding these things through these sort of efforts, like Orange Shirt Day, allows like my generation maybe to look back and understand my grandparents or even my father and maybe some of the things in their life that happened that impacted even our own personal relationships now. So I really view it as a destruction of the Native family and that family unit. I have one grandmother that said that she had been away so long and so often from her home in a boarding school. She said that she would come home and the younger siblings would say things like, Mama, when are these people going to leave? Her younger siblings really thought that they were just guests there. And to feel like you were not a part of that family unit was really no doubt devastating. Not to mention, there were so many other things like the number of deaths that occurred in these boarding schools, your immune system, close quarters. There's just a number of huge reasons of why all of these things happened. But there were many children that didn't come home. So Orange Shirt Day is not just to honor those survivors and understand their story, but it's also to remember those that didn't make it home. And we are seeing in South Dakota the repatriation of children from Carlisle boarding school just this past week with Oglala. And then also our friends and indigenous relatives in Montana also had another repatriation. This Saturday, we had the 1 year anniversary memorial of two boys from Carlisle, Amos Laframboise and Edward Upright. Sisseton-Wahpeton of Lake Traverse here, our tribe, and Sisseton-Wahpeton of Spirit Lake joined together to bring these two children home. And the entire experience of that, what began 6 years ago and was ultimately a fight with the US Army, the Department of Defense, to regain control of our children and to bring them home in the manner that we felt honored them and allowed for our traditions, our culture, and the things that we needed to even do spiritually, because the Army wished to return our children in their manner, like a military cemetery policy would require. So instead of the sort of with the American flag, slow salute, here you go kind of a thing, what we ultimately fought for and what ultimately happened was us traveling to Carlisle as a tribe, as extended families, and we came with our traditional songs. We came in regalia. We came with our leaders. One elder gentleman had told me when he realized this story and who these boys were. They are children of our traditional leaders. They are children of chiefs. And he had said, when you bring them home, you bring them home like the chiefs that they are. You bring them home in buffalo robes. You give them that honor, because these men, these young men, these boys would have been our next leaders. And they, along with many of the children there at Carlisle, were our best and brightest. They were, the future of their tribes rested on their shoulders. And so to lose incredible young men at the age of 13, 14, it was devastating, not just to a mother and a family, but to an entire nation. Each of the children as children of chiefs, and you see the same thing with Oglala and Rosebud, as well as the Blackfoot Nation, the Arapaho, and others that have repatriated their children. They are the children. You see names like Spotted Tail. You see names like American Horse, and in our tribe, you see names like Renville, Laframboise, who are the founding fathers of the reservation here. So really what it was not just the assimilation practice, but it was also an effort by the federal government at the time in 1879 in Carlisle to control the tribal nations. In one instance, I read a newspaper that talked about the chiefs coming to Washington, D.C. And I always thought it was strange that the notation on it said, the chiefs from the Dakotas are here in Washington, D.C. And as a condition to the negotiations, they will be allowed to see their children at Carlisle. What a terrible thing to use children as pawns to bring the chiefs to DC, to encourage them and almost even coerce them to sign agreements. These are very real things. These are very real things in our history and the things that our children and our families were subjected to.
I think it's worthwhile pointing out that the backdrop to all of these actions was a concerted effort for genocide. I mean, just literal genocide. And there were some heads who said, well, we don't have to kill them all. Maybe we could just turn them into white people, and then we don't have to suffer the inevitable and permanent stain of having our country established over by genocide, which ultimately that is what happened, but it gave you some kind of out, because since all of them weren't exterminated, then you could say, well, it wasn't a complete genocide. you know.
And
So I think it's worthwhile to have that in the story.
I agree with you. I think as a researcher, I know that we as Native people have many stories, oral histories, things that have been passed down generations and within families. But, the researcher in me tends to rely on things that I can document. And I always say that every statement that I make, I can back it up with a citation and where that information is found. So when you see things in black and white that maybe you grew up hearing all your life, it's really sets me back a little bit to think, wow, here it is, the absolute proof that these things were really done. I had an uncle that used to tell me, all of these things, Tamara, were by design. These things didn't just happen to Native people. And so when you look at things like, and genocide is a really strong word. And when I see things like the governor Ramsey in Minnesota to have called for the extermination of the Dakota and the removals that happened to push them all west, or we see things like at Whitestone Hill, the military records that say that they had burned all of their teepees, the meat that they had stored for winter, and that they had even punched holes in their cooking gear and threw them into the water in order to leave them destitute for winter. Those are real things that call for extermination. These are real examples of what is genocide. So in that era of what is extermination, removal, genocide, then we move into what is the assimilation era, the reservation era. And within that, some of the principles are still very much the same, because like Captain Pratt at Carlisle says, kill the Indian, save the man. So you are really trying to kill, everything that makes a person Dakota. And, I had told a colleague that, really hadn't been around in indigenous nations before, if you can imagine, the feeling of everything about you is wrong, the way you speak, the color of your skin, how you wear your hair, how you pray, all of these things need to be not just eliminated or stopped. Some of those things were done by law. Even just recently, in the past few years, we worked with Senator Rounds on something called the Respect Act, which removed antiquated language that was so offensive out of off the books, in federal code. And so things that actually talked about the withholding of rations for a family that didn't wish to send their child to a boarding school. The idea that you could withhold rations, essentially starve them out to, get them to cooperate. Again, these are very, very real things. And, some of those tactics and even in a broader sense, in federal Indian policy in those years, we hear a lot about the so-called battles, things like Wounded Knee or the massacre at Whitestone Hill, Sand Creek, and others, because it's not just us as Dakota. But, we hear about all of those sort of things. And I know that people tend to focus on that military history, but the reality is that those sort of policies, those federal policies that withheld food, starvation tactics killed more Native people than any bullet or gun. And again, these are very real things that I think, when you look at our history, we need to understand.
And I think what's really important in today's world is the efforts to cover that up and to not talking about it in schools so that children don't have an idea of what the history was. And to me, the one of the current downsides is that it allows us to put forth the narrative that everybody was on an equal level. And if they were like us, they could succeed without talking about, well, what are all the things that you're doing under the hood to break their kneecaps, and then complain that they can't run fast enough.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think it's probably no secret that I've been an advocate for tribal history in our public schools. And, it is important how that story is told. I had said once, not just relaying history in a factual manner, but also knowing that, there are people that are very interested in this history. And there are times when they say to me things like, wow, I've never heard this before. You can look at any American textbook, and just for this purpose, I do keep a few old textbooks. And when you go through it, you don't see the things that speak to our existence here as Indigenous people. It almost looks as if this was just wide open space and people came, and not acknowledging the 500 nations that called this home. And so when we look at our history, or academia, for example, you hear things like prehistoric, which might not be the way that we tell our history. We don't begin with Columbus arrived. That's kind of ridiculous. So our understandings of ourselves and where we lived and how we lived, and the major events that happened that maybe were recorded in things like our winter counts, or we may not have always had a written language. We were very much, oral historians. But, for example, the things like our burial sites, our places of prayer, the things that the archaeologists maybe know, these are all evidence of our existence here on these lands. And I think, it's part of the work that my office does, in not just the effort to take control of our cultural history by telling our own story, but also protecting the cultural resources and things that really are evidence of our existence here.
I want to open it up now to our esteemed panel here, who are all have joined us, and give them a chance to weigh in on this conversation, ask questions, tell their story. Anybody? Go ahead, Vicki.
I have a couple complex questions. I really was raised here in South Dakota till about 14, went to California and then came back. I never knew any of this. I was kind of astounded just this last year to realize when I was a child here at 13, this was happening to other Native American children. And I've learned as much as I can to this point, but I still have these questions. The one thing that concerns me is why there wasn't a written language and what are the implications of that in the early 1900s. That I can't really answer. But the thing that I was thinking about mostly when you were talking was, aside from the trauma, which was great, I know, I don't have any experience with that. I've worked in the squatter camps in South Africa. I've seen some problems down there. But I just have this assumption, it's probably a very white assumption, that if the kids were put in school and originally they weren't reading and writing, this was a good thing. And so then I was thinking, well, maybe I don't really understand what they were taught in these schools. I kept thinking, what were the skills that they learned in the schools? Could they have used them after they get out when they're 18? Or was the trauma so apparent and overwhelming that they came out in a negative way rather than a positive way as contributors to society? Was it so devastating? And how was that? I mean, I think if they were taught geography and history, and even though it wasn't their own, I understand that, but didn't they pick up skills that would have helped them mean, wasn't there something good about the values, or were the schools so poor and devastating to them emotionally that they came out less than what they could have been? Do you know what I mean?
I would love to answer that question, if that's okay, Lawrence.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
that is a really great comment, because when I talked to my own grandmother, who at the age of 7 was sent out to the Rapid City boarding school, 7 years old, I looked at my own 7-year-old and I felt so sad. I can't even imagine a child being sent so far away from their family. But she did talk about her experience there, but she also said, keep in mind that a person could learn a lot of good things at a boarding school. Education is great. It absolutely is. But I think the aspects that I think were damaging, and, of course, in some instances, there were things like physical abuse, even sexual abuse. There were horrendous things that happened in some of these schools, but there were also schools that maybe those things didn't occur. I read in one instance in Carlisle where it was stated in a story that, those sort of things, as far as physical punishment, are not a part of our policy. So regardless of whether or not the physical abuse were to happen, the devastation of being so far away from your family, the breakdown of the family, the loneliness, all of those things, I think were huge, huge impacts. I think also the devastation to us as a people, as a community, in the loss of language, the loss of understanding our own place in the world, the loss of understanding our own history, all of those things that existed before. Even the things like the sort of social norms or protocols that went along with how we lived as people, all of these things are huge, huge changes to tribes who maybe lived in a different way, whether you were a farming society, or maybe you hunted buffalo and were more nomadic. All of these things required certain understandings amongst your people, and how you not only policed yourself, but how you interacted. All of these things, these changes were huge and devastating. But yes, as far as boarding schools, education wise, and there still exists federal boarding schools today. But I think we understand, and I am somebody that believes, as a country, as people, when we know better, we do better. And I believe that what happened in these boarding schools in the 1800s and through the 1900s, what we saw were efforts to build the day schools and things that were closer. We even saw different families or tribal leaders that would donate land in order to have a school nearby where their children could attend and be able to come home. And you could certainly monitor your child and whether they're being fed. My grandmother had said in Rapid City boarding school that she was very small, and her older siblings that were there used to sneak her bread, or, to be able to ensure that she was eating or having enough food to be able to survive. And I think we do know that those horrendous practices in the 1800s in some of these boarding schools, where the sort of experiments on, how much is it required to sustain a child's life. Those were really real things. And when you see those things written in a 1 through 10 type policy on how to run a school, it can be pretty shocking. But yeah, I think it's a fair point that education is great. I think that there were things like doctors, professionals, and others that came out of the education efforts. But I think how things were done, and for a number of people, I think the breakdown of the Native American families, some of the other impacts, whether there was actual physical abuse or not, are really devastating.
I'd like to add a couple of things to your comments, Tamara. One is language is written when you have kind of nation states, if you are living with people all the time, let's say in a tribal setting, especially in bands where you have just or just a village kind of level, they're writing down something. If those are pretty much your only contacts, and maybe you contact other people, but not often, and you're not exchanging things, there's no pressure to create a written system. And so you don't, because, even if you look at a written system today, writing usually is a poor reflection of speech, and speech is a poor reflection of thought. So people, when you're living day to day and human connections are important, you don't have a sense that you need a written language. And you can find that all over, that written languages happen typically when nation states develop, and you have to speak to you in another way. And I'm always reminded of a comment that Buckminster Fuller mentioned to me and others. We were in a group, that writing wasn't invented to disseminate information. It was invented to hide information. And he explained a lot about that, but it's, as I grow older and realize how many things are hidden in the written word, and how much we have to, quote, explain and interpret the written word all over, you start to see what he was saying. I start to see what he was saying. The other thing is, again, I mentioned that backdrop of trying to exterminate, or commit genocide. If you have the right intent, efforts follow intent, and what you do follow what your intent was. If your intent was to really support the native people in some kind of equitable way, you do it different. And if I look at like what happens with let's say with inmates right now, and I do some work at the prison, there are a lot of things that we could change. Like, for example, we know that if an inmate gets a college education, there's almost zero chance that it will come back to prison. It's cheaper for us to give that person an education, if they will do it, give them an education and pay for that, than pay $30,000 to $50,000 a year to keep them in prison. But we can't, that's hard to do, because if we introduce that to the public, they would be freaked out. They would be complaining. Even when we provided intranet, which means they can only communicate what the prison wants them to communicate. Even when we provide those tablets, people were complaining. We do a thing every Christmas where we give the chaplains get together and we give them chocolate, handmade, by the way. We give them things. It's a small bag just to say Merry Christmas. Every year we get reports back that there are people in this state who write the governor complaining that they got chocolate. How dare you give? And it doesn't cost the taxpayer anything. We pay for it. We take up donations and we pay for it. But people don't like to see that. I can imagine if you took these kids to a school and they got treated fairly and they got treated well and they excelled, somebody would lose an election, right? So I think that is the problem, is that the intent was wrong, and where it came from was wrong. So if that's wrong, then what you do is probably not going to be optimal.
Well, to speak to that, as I've said before, I think, when we know better, we do better. And I think at that time, as a historian, you always see there are opposing sides, those that believe that the allotment system was the best way to go, versus I think one of the most incredible things, and that happened, the real game changers of things like self-determination, self-government actually came during the conservative administration in America. Those are very huge things that changed the world around us. So I think as far as intent, there's always, even at the worst of things that had occurred, I can easily see another group that's saying this is not the right way. We need to, make these changes. So, the boarding school portion of it, and, it does, I want to reiterate that there were great boarding schools or great boarding school experiences, and I can definitely name a few. There were horrific, the horrific, traumatizing boarding school experiences. I think even in one instance, became the end of spirituality for some families. If you can imagine, and I'll use my own family as an example. I have a great grandfather that was a Catholic lay reader, and they were so involved. And I had asked my father, what was life like back then, when the family attended the church? And my father was an altar boy himself. But because of the physical and worse abuse that occurred within my father's family, a whole generation stopped attending church. They wanted nothing to do with it. And then I saw young people, shockingly, I can only imagine that this happened in some form for some families. There was one young girl that had mentioned to me, before I went into treatment, she said, in rehab, she said, I wasn't even aware that there was a God. So zero spirituality, whether it's traditional or Christian or whatever, the cutting off of these things because of the awful experiences or the trauma is truly devastating. So, we're having to reconnect a lot of things. When I talk about, I can think of, for example, the missionaries that had a school here on the Lake Travis Reservation. And, there was no physical abuse that happened there. The people that were educated there, when I read through some of the things that occurred there, there were many beautiful things. And the missionaries that helped to develop our written language in the 1850, they originated with the translation of the Bible, French, and then to Dakota, Dakota to French, and then to English. All of these things, I think, are all a part of the story. There are no black and whites to anything. There are many different perspectives in all of this. If somebody were to ask me about boarding schools, the one thing I would center on really is the devastation of mental health for these long-term type boarding schools. It isn't like now when you think of a boarding school or sending any child to a boarding school, we're talking about rounding them up with law enforcement and dragging children out of their mother's arms. One beautiful lady here that recently spoke at the Dignity event in Mitchell. In her speech, she talked about how she herself had not attended a boarding school. She said, because my grandmother hid me. And, if you can imagine hiding children because you don't want them taken from you, they're too little, or this one is sick and they need me. I don't want my child to go there, or whatever. These sort of things are different than just simply giving a child an opportunity for an education. And I think that is an important part. yes, many people, I think that there was great value in many, I think Native parents did consider those things, like how are we going to survive as Native people? The ways of the past are over. How do we progress? My father talked about how his grandmother had urged the learning of English, and she would say in Dakota, look how good my grandchild can speak Washichu, which means, the English language. And instead now, we hear a lot of talk about, regaining control of our traditional languages and knowing how we spoke and expressed ourselves, to bring that back, within us and within our communities. But there was that time. And that's why so many parents maybe even agreed. I have seen in some records where one individual that was recruiting children to attend this boarding school had come to a family and said, I see that you're struggling. You have children that you can't feed. I can feed them better than you can. Send them to my school and we will educate them. They'll do so much better. And so the mother had agreed to it. But what truly happened was so damaging to the son that, when I interviewed him as an adult, it was a very emotional thing. And he said, what happened to me there, he said, haunts me every day. He said, I could be working on my truck, I could be tending to my horses, and I pause and I think about that. Why would people, you mentioned that in your poem. He's really saying to himself, why would anybody do that to little kids? That may not be everybody's experience, but it was certainly his. And it was certainly something that damaged him and many, many other children. So, it really isn't possible to say, are boarding schools 100% good or are they 100% bad? But I do believe that at the root of all of these things are federal policies that ultimately were very damaging to us. And so when you see things that like self-determination, self-government, which also included the beginnings of our tribal colleges and our tribal schools, where we are able to educate our children in an environment that nurtures their cultural identity, those are very powerful things. And I find amazing children, young people coming from that environment.
Stacy has her hand up, but would you be thinking about where we go next? Because that's where I want to go. Stacy?
Yeah. Hi, Tamara. My question is a little bit broad. I know that Carlisle was, I believe, opened in 1879, and Flander Indian School dates before that to like 1873. So it's one of only 4 remaining off-reservation boarding schools in the entire nation. And when I was reading a report that came out, I read an article about a report that there were originally 32 boarding schools in South Dakota, and that there are 3 that have no marked or unmarked burial sites. So my roundabout question here is there an effort ongoing or in the future to look at the other locations of the other boarding schools of the 32 to see if there's more marked or unmarked burial sites on those former boarding school locations, especially Flander, because it's older than Carlisle?
Thank you so much for that question, because about 2 years ago, I attended in Canada, Edmonton, Canada, the first annual gathering of First Nations to acknowledge unmarked burials, missing children. And that is a reality. I know that there have been like sort of the ground penetrating radar type studies on some of these school campuses. And all that ground penetrating radar really does is acknowledge the abnormalities. And so you could possibly look, and that may not be a burial, but the reality is that even at Carlisle, and I'll give you an example of the tribe that came before us to get their child who was in a grave with a headstone there. They were from Puyallup, I'm not going to say their name right. I am so sorry. But they were there the day before us. And what they found when they had began to remove the child from that grave, that it was not even a boy. It wasn't a boy. Or there have been other instances where they opened up a grave and the family wished to take that child home, and it wasn't their child. It was even, in fact, two people. So these things are really things that result in what would be a missing children. So like the boy that that tribe had intended to bring home is now on the list of missing. Or that there are, for example, I've worked with Nebraska and the Genoa Indian school, the Genoa, Nebraska government school, where they cannot locate the grave. I'm sorry, they cannot locate the cemetery. So there have been ongoing consultations and discussions on how they're going to address the number of burials that are there and how do they access this. About 4 years ago in Avoca, Minnesota, the sisters there who are great friends of mine now, had reached out because there were 6 girls that are buried in the field where there used to be a school. So, these are really real things. And how do we address the unmarked graves or the missing children where a family isn't able to find, the resting place of their child? And bear in mind that I've seen letters, especially in Carlisle, of families that are like one man saying, my wife wishes to please gaze upon the face of her child once again. Please allow her to be sent home so that we can lay her to rest, and da da da. And the response being, no, we don't have the money to do that. She will be buried here on campus. And these things are real things. I can't even imagine as a parent losing your child and being devastated and then not being able to bring them home. We live in very different times. At that time, a tribe or a family may have not had means or an ability or even the political power to enforce that a child be brought home. These are huge discussions. And I know Lawrence and I had said, we could go pretty deep and broad with some of this.
That's right. And we should, and we should keep this conversation going. And I'm so happy that you're involved in this project, Tamara. I would like to now turn to potential solutions, because and things we can do, because I think it's not good enough, let's say, just to have the albatross of guilt, because that usually that doesn't help very much and often harms. But I think we need to if we feel any concern about it, we need to be looking for, okay, well, what can I do? Is it going to solve everything? Most likely not. But it can do. Just because we can't do everything doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything. Right. So let's do what we can do. Give us some ideas of like what some people could do as individual efforts, or joining your efforts or other people's efforts. What's out there for us?
Well, I think first of all, as far as guilt goes, at one point as a very young historian, it didn't even occur to me that that would be the reaction to us just telling our own history. And I've worked with academics and others and a bunch of history nerds, and we're all, we're all in this together and trying to understand what happened. So I had said a few years back, I could talk about genocide, I could talk about broken treaties and tribal history all day long and never make anybody in the room feel as if they did anything. I don't feel like it is necessarily appropriate to take that lens from the 1800s and look at the whole world around me just from that standpoint. You know, there have always been those that have wished and pushed for better and pushed for change. And I think we need to be those people, and we need to do those things. And when we see something that is an obstacle, or maybe what might inhibit a child from learning and accomplishing or growing or whatever it might be a part of some of those solutions. But I do think that, of course, as a historian, the sharing of our history, just like this program right here today, everybody on this is already doing what I think is a part of the solution. And so when we understand these things, and I'm old enough now to have worked in this area long enough where you can take something that maybe nobody really looked at, and then we just accepted what maybe was always said, and do that sort of a deep dive and examine history in a broader way. And in the end, you know, develop better understanding or mutual respect. You know, part of this is just one aspect, Orange Shirt Day, boarding schools. You know, there are so many other aspects, you know, altogether. I think, you know, the goal is really to get an understanding of tribal nations and tribal people, Native people, who they are, aside from the stereotypes that movies have always said about us. I had told one amazing congressman who listened to me go on for hours and hours. And he said, Tamara, what's the takeaway here? And I told him, I want you to understand that when you sit in a committee room and you're looking at incarceration rates, you're looking at poverty, you're looking at drug addiction, all of these things, I want you to know that these rates, these things, these numbers are a result of all of these things that happen to us. They are not because of the stereotypes like we are lazy, we don't want to work, or we're not you know, capable. I want you to know that what you are witnessing is a result of devastation, and what's happening now is our recovery. We are growing in leaps and bounds. Really, you know, instead of a headline out there about, you know, whatever it might be in a negative light, come and visit a tribe. I'm a huge advocate for tourism that invites people into our community, see what we're doing for our youth, see what we've built, see what our plans are. And if there's any way to help to overcome obstacles, be a part of that. So sharing the stories, making that space to be able to allow a person such as myself to also share. I have never wanted to rewrite history. I've heard that said. I have always only asserted to share a perspective that maybe hasn't been told before. And the biggest example of that is I don't fault America for telling their American history. Be proud of it. I love American history. I love our state history, our county histories, the families and cultures, the fabric that makes South Dakota. But often our story as Native people hasn't been a part of that. So by adding that into it, I think, and allowing for that tribal history to have its proper place in all of this, you know, you learn about the archaeology, you know, learn about, you know, the things that are the evidence of our existence here, and not just that Columbus came, or, you know, the West was tamed, you know,
And
that sort of
and
thing.
it all started there, as opposed to well, what happened 10,000 years
Yeah.
before that? One of the things I want to leave, because we're right getting up against our clock.
Mhm.
One of the things I think that's useful is to see Native Americans as people and as a person, as opposed to the whole group, and then try to create this group and
Yeah.
then try to address that, because that's kind of like trying to swallow the whole elephant. And people have different things, different tribes, different bands, they have different
Mhm.
points of views. And just create some relationships, for Pete's sake, and then through those relationships, you can see things. You probably knew Dorothy Gill.
Oh, yes, she's
Yeah,
a
so
grandmother.
right. So Dorothy was my inroads to
Sorry.
Dorothy was my inroads to that. And sitting at her dinner table and interacting with her kids, grandkids, and great grandkids, interacting with them gave me a whole insight that
Right.
wouldn't even be told in a history book, you know.
Right.
And she kind of knew the history too, lots of
Oh, yeah.
history.
Oh, yeah, she did.
We're up against 11:30. I want to really thank you for joining us, Tamara, and I hope we can continue this conversation not only on this program but personally, you know, because you'll be switching duties, and so we'll have you on this side of the state more, and we'll get to know each other, and maybe there's some resources that I have, and you know, cross reference our resources.
Sure.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you next week, same time, same station, and keep on keeping on. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Too.
Bye.